Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group, continuing with Individuation Volume 2. We're going to start the text Form, Information, and Potentials. It might take us 2 to 3 weeks, I think, to get through it, depending on how far we get each time. But so last time we read the end of Allegmatics. I won't do like a detailed summary of that text, but I guess I'll just mention that right at the end of that text, there's a sort of program for what philosophy should do in terms of looking at the different levels of individuation and how they relate to each other, and the sort of reciprocity between structure and operation being sort of the organizing principle of philosophical thought. So the sciences, as they exist, are sciences of structure. They look at particular configurations of entities, whether it's biology or chemistry or whatever. And then Simondon is sort of pointing towards a future development of a science of operations, and he sees cybernetics as being the first step in this direction. And then he sees the role of philosophy as having to do with the conversion from one to the other. So the relationship between operations and structures, and operations of operations, and so on. So this whole sort of program for philosophy will look at different levels of individuation. So he points to physical, biological, psychological, and social systems, and so that more or less corresponds to what we actually end up getting in Individuation Volume 1 that we've gone through. So that's sort of his working out of the program. So Allegmatics, the text Allegmatics, is a kind of programmatic text, and then we have the realization of that program in Individuation Volume 1. And then Form, Information, Potentials is a text that is subsequent to Individuation Volume 1, or roughly contemporary. So it's the text of a presentation that Simondon gave to the French Society of Philosophy in 1960. So we actually read through this text before we started Individuation over a year ago. I don't know exactly when that was, but we read an earlier translation that included both the presentation itself and then the discussion period afterwards, which is sort of the in the general publications of January 2020. That's a long time ago. Oh, 2021. Okay, yeah, that seems that seems about right. Anyway, yeah. So the sort of general format of these presentations to the French Society of Philosophy is there's a presentation and then there's a discussion afterwards. So the version we read, the translation we read before we started Individuation, contained both those parts, but the version that's included here in Individuation Volume 2 is only the presentation, so we don't have the discussion part. So we'll just go through Simondon's presentation and discuss what issues come up or what questions we have as we go along. Okay, so I'll read the first bit. Oh, maybe one last point. Yeah, so the first bit is you'll see there's a heading in the text that says argument. So that's the sort of summary of the presentation that was distributed to attendees before the presentation, and then Simondon gives his actual lecture, and then the participants give their comments and questions and so on afterwards. But we don't have that part, so I'll read through the argument part and then we can discuss. The absence of a general theory of the human sciences and of psychology makes it urgent for reflexive thought to seek the conditions of a possible axiomatization. With a view to initiating this labor, which necessarily involves a certain contribution of invention and cannot be the result of a pure synthesis, it is appropriate to revisit the main conceptual systems that have been employed without granting any privilege to the most recent ones. The discoveries of chemical theory at the beginning of the 19th century have renewed the atomistic schemas that were sketched out more than 20 centuries ago and have enriched them with the contribution of gravimetric analysis. In this sense, we could analogously renew the principles of the indefinite dyad of the archetype of form and matter and bring them in line with the recent explanatory models of Gestalt psychology and then those of cybernetics and information theory, by going so far as to invoke certain notions taken from the physical sciences, like that of potential. We would like to show that an outline of the axiomatics of the human sciences, or at least of psychology, is possible if we attempt to grasp the three notions of form, information, and potential together, on condition of adding, so as to internally link them and organize them, the definition of a particular type of operation that appears when there is form, information, and potential, that of the transductive operation. First, the notion of form, in all the doctrines in which it appears, plays a constant functional role, that of a structural germ, which is a certain guiding and organizing power. The notion of form supposes a basic duality between two types of reality, the reality that receives form and the reality that is form or harbors form. This privilege of form depends on its unity, its totality, and its essential self-coherence. Even in Gestalt psychology, the form, which is no longer anterior to any matter, nevertheless conserves its superiority of Ganzheit, totality, and there is a hierarchy of forms, good form, better form. Whether immanent or transcendent, prior to form taking or contemporaneous with this operation, form conserves its privilege of superiority with respect to matter or the elements. The foundation of every theory of form, whether it be archetypal, hylomorphic, or gestaltist, is the qualitative, functional, and hierarchical asymmetry of form and of that which takes form. Second, the notion of information, on the contrary, is the keystone of every doctrine of reciprocity, equivalence, or reversibility of the active term and the passive term in the exchange. The emitter and the receiver are the two homogeneous extremities of a line in which information is transmitted with the maximum guarantee when the operation is reversible. Reversibility and univocity are supposed not only by the fact of control, but by the very condition of intelligibility. Coding and decoding are carried out according to conventions shared by the emitter and the receiver. Only a content can be transmitted, not a code. Information theory can be associated with any type of explanation that presupposes the symmetry and homogeneity of elements that are combined and take form through a process of addition or juxtaposition. More generally, the quantitative phenomena of mass and population, which stem from chaos theory and suppose the symmetry of elements and their unspecified character, can be thought in information theory. Third, the transductive operation would be the propagation of a structure of increasingly accumulating a field starting with a structural germ, like a supersaturated solution crystallizes starting with a crystalline germ. This supposes that the field is in metastable equilibrium, i.e. contains a potential energy that can be unleashed only through the emergence of a new structure, which is like a resolution of the problem. Consequently, information is not reversible. It is a short-range organizing direction emanating from the structural germ and progressing through the field. The germ is the emitter, the field is the receiver, and the limit between the emitter and the receiver is continuously displaced when the operation of form-taking occurs by progressing. It could be said that the limit between the structural germ and the structurable metastable field is a modulator. The energy of the field's metastability, and thus the energy of matter, is what makes it possible for structure and thus form to advance. Potentials reside in matter, and the limit between form and matter is an amplificative relay. Phenomena of mass are not at all negligible, but they must be considered as conditions of the accumulation of potential energy in a field, and properly speaking, as conditions of the creation of the field as a possible domain of transductivity, which supposes a relative homogeneity and a progressive division of energetic potentials. The matter-form relation is thereby transposed into the transductive relation and into the progress of the structured couple across an active limit, which is the passage of information. Right, so this is a pretty dense summary of what he's going to go through in the rest of the text. So some of the obscurity of what he talks about here is going to be cleared up by reading the presentation itself. But we can still see the, general strategy that he presents here is one of sort of re-energizing or renewing certain concepts that are drawn from ancient philosophy in the light of modern scientific developments. And so his model here, or his example of this strategy, is the revival of the atomistic hypothesis at the beginning of the 19th century. So, of course, atomism is was a philosophical doctrine that was proposed in ancient Greece by Democritus and Leucippus. So this was essentially a philosophical hypothesis at that point. But then in the early 19th century, when chemists start to use gravimetric analysis, so they start to use precise weighing of different stages of a chemical reaction. So you weigh all your ingredients that you're starting from, you mix them together or perform whatever sort of chemical operation you want on them, and then you weigh the results, including capturing the smoke that is emitted and weighing that smoke and things like that. So you want to weigh every component of the operation. And of course, if you do that precisely, then the total mass of the result is equal to the total mass of the inputs. But as a result of this sort of use of precise weighing of all the components of a chemical operation, the atomistic hypothesis was sort of re-energized or reformulated and used in a new context with much more precise scientific meaning, as opposed to being a sort of philosophical hypothesis as it was in ancient Greece. And so it now had so you could assert not just that the atoms of mercury are different than the atoms of iron, for example, but you could give a precise weight. You could say the atoms of mercury are, X% heavier than the atoms of iron, or vice versa. So you have a much more the atomistic hypothesis has much more content in the 19th century than it did in 5th century BC Greece. And so that's sort of the general approach that Simondon wants to take here, is to take certain concepts, particularly the concepts of form and matter, and try to reformulate them in light of more recent scientific developments. So he points to Gestalt psychology and cybernetics and information theory as the main sort of domains of inspiration here. And so Gestalt psychology, of course, is oriented in general towards the notion of form, and so there's an obvious link with the hylomorphic doctrine, or the concept of form and matter from ancient philosophy. And then, so Simondon is going to sort of go through the connection that he sees here. So there's this notion of form as a kind of hierarchical notion. So there's there's a distinction between form and matter, in the sense that the form is sort of self-contained or self-coherent in a way that matter is not. And then form has also the capacity to impose its form onto matter. So this form matter pair is hierarchical in that sense, that the form has a sort of primacy over matter. It has the capacity to impose itself on matter. And then there's also this hierarchy within the forms themselves, between, say, a good form and a better form, or a good form and a less good form. So that's what Simondon takes to be the sort of the central concept of form. And then information is sort of in contrast to this hierarchical concept of form, is a reciprocal concept. So an information transmission channel, like a telephone line, is sort of the type of technical object that Simondon was thinking of here. So this information transmission channel is something that can transmit information reversibly. So you can, like on a telephone line, you can receive information from someone else, and you can also transmit information to someone else. And it's the emitter and the receiver of information are sort of more adapted to each other the more similar they are to each other, in the sense that if the receiver can sort of has a set of possible states that matches the set of possible states of the transmitter, then you can transmit information from one to the other in a lossless manner. So you can, for each state of the transmitter, you can have one state of the receiver that corresponds to it, and so in that sense, you can transmit information about the state of the transmitter without losing any information in when the receiver receives the information. And then the third point that he introduces here is the notion of a transductive operation, which of course we've seen throughout volume 1 and the other texts that we've read in volume 2 of Individuation. So this is a transductive operation is an operation of form taking or of structuring that progresses gradually across a domain that is unstructured. So the sort of stock example that he always uses is the crystallization example. So you have a supersaturated solution, and then there's a structuring germ, a crystalline germ within this solution, and then around this germ, the crystal forms in layers. So each the surface of the crystal will accrete new crystalline structure, and then the new surface, new structure, new crystal forms on that surface, and so it progressively structures the whole solution. And so this is sort of his model for how form sort of is transmitted across something that is not formed, and so this transductive operation is the model that he wants to use for form taking or the generation of form in something that is not already formed.
This point that he makes about reversibility in hylomorphism, information theory, and transduction, I think is interesting. It's hylomorphic form taking is irreversible. Information and information theory is ideally perfectly reversible. And he also says that I think in transduction, it's not reversible. But the transduction that he's talking about here is the transduction that he associates with the physical domain in Individuation Volume 1. And in the, at least in the psychic domain, and I think in the biological domain, there's a different kind of transduction, which is the, he calls it like a qualitative or intensive spectrum that spreads out from a center. But I guess with respect to reversibility, he often talks about signification as problem resolution. And I wonder if the kind of transduction that characterizes psychic individuation, if he would see it as more reversible than the transduction in physical individuation, which I think would be, I think it's, if psychic individuation involves like philosophical problems, for instance, I think it would be maybe more interesting to see those structurations as reversible than as irreversible in the sense that like crystalline structuration is.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection to make. What comes to mind for me is the bit in the conclusion where he talks about, in the conclusion of volume 1, I should say, where he talks about about death in living beings and how living beings, they have their, a living being is in a metastable state because it's always capable of undergoing further transformation and development and solving problems and so on. But there's a sort of finite stock of this metastability in a living being. So we each have a certain capacity to solve problems in our vital individuation, but that capacity is exhausted at some point, and that's what death is. So there's a kind of internality of death to the living being in the sense that it's by virtue of the activity of a living being is problem solving and undergoing this transductive operation. But by virtue of performing that activity, you are sort of using up your capacity to perform that activity in the future. And so it's in that sense that death is internal to the life of a living being. And so I think the sort of reversible type of structuration that you were pointing to in vital individuation to some extent, and then probably more so in psychical individuation. It seems like for Simondon, this reversibility sort of rests upon an ultimate irreversibility, and to the extent that we think that physical individuation is the most fundamental form of individuation, and then vital individuation is a sort of as Simondon described it, as is a kind of slowing down of physical individuation. Um, so if we think that vital individuation and psychical individuation are in some sense grounded in physical individuation, then it would make sense that the irreversibility of physical individuation would sort of have consequences at the level of vital individuation as well. So we even though there is this reversibility in the sense that you can, so a living being can, say, acquire a habit and learn that pressing this lever makes sugar water come out of the tube or whatever. But then they can also unacquire that habit if the experiment changes and then pressing the lever produces an electric shock instead. They can learn to not press the lever. So that's a sort of basic example, but a living being can acquire a structure and then sort of destructure that structure. But that whole process, even though there's a sort of, at one level, there's a reversibility, at another level, that process of learning and then unlearning and then learning a new pattern is a kind of involves a using up of that metastability stock, or that sort of finite capacity of metastability that makes up a living being. And so that there's a kind of a finitude of metastability that is characteristic of vital individuation as well, and then irreversibility that underlies the reversibility.
Yeah, I think that the point about the death by stabilization and vital individuation, I always thought that was really interesting in light of the idea that vital individuation is like a slowed down physical individuation, because it seems like you could see the death by stabilization as like a much slower form of crystallization. It just kind of arrives at the same place, but much more slowly.
Yeah, so in the case of the crystal, the actual form taking is essentially instantaneous. So each layer of the crystallization happens instantaneously, or so quickly that there's no perceptual time that passes, and then the crystallization of the whole solution happens relatively quickly as well. Maybe in a few hours, or depending on how big the jar is or whatever. But and then Simondon points out that the crystal itself has no sort of temporal structure, in the sense that once the crystal is formed, the inside of the crystal is just sort of dead and inert. The only operation that happens in crystallization is at the limit of the crystal, whereas in a living being, the living being has a sort of temporal structure inherent to it, in the sense that the living being has an inside and an outside, and the inside and outside interact with each other in various ways, and there's a sort of simultaneity of the living being, whereas the crystal has the interior. Simondon points out the interior of a crystal is anterior. It's sort of a dead past that has no direct impact on the present, which the present of the crystal is only at its limit, where the crystallization is actually happening now, whereas the living being is sort of simultaneous with itself. Every component of the living being is in interaction with every other component, and so it's as if the living being is completely, like, it's as if the limit of the crystal is sort of spread out throughout the whole crystal in a living being. So the whole living being is undergoing that modulation, that structuration, but ultimately at the end of lifespan, the living being sort of reverts to a physical individuation like a crystal, in the sense that it has an anterior that is not part of its living individuation anymore, and so so it's a sort of slower version of it's as if that moment of individuation at the limit of a crystal is expanded to spread out over a lifespan instead of taking place instantaneously. But then the end point of that individuation is still a physical entity, which has an anterior and a present in the same way that a crystal does. Yeah, we were before we started recording, we were talking about the whole notion of an end of history, and maybe crystallization sort of points towards this, or maybe we can think of the end of history as a kind of crystallization, where history as a whole process of individuation would sort of come to an end with something analogous to a crystal that has an anterior that is no longer operative. That's an interesting comparison. I haven't really thought about that.
Or maybe if your thinking just slows down enough, you begin to think that you are living in the end of history.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read a page or so, I think. About a page. Yeah.
Yeah, I can read. So this is, I guess, the lecture itself. Mr. Director, ladies and gentlemen, as Director Berger just pointed out, there is a certain relation between a study of the technical object and the problem presented here, which is that of form, information, and potentials. However, the technical object is only meant to serve as a model, example, and perhaps paradigm for interpreting in a way that we do not seek to present as new, but in a way that we hope might be explanatory. The problem of the rapport between the notion of form and its various types, the notion of information, and ultimately the notion of potential or potential energy. What encouraged us to seek a correlation between form, information, and potentials is the will to find the starting point for an axiomatics of the human sciences. In our day, we speak of the human sciences, and there are indeed technologies of human manipulation. But this phrase, quote unquote, human sciences, is always in the plural. The plural probably signifies that we have not managed to define a unitary axiomatics for it. Why are there multiple human sciences when there is only a physics? Why are we always obligated to speak of psychology, sociology, and psychosociology? Why are we obligated to distinguish different fields of study within psychology, sociology, and social psychology? And we shall not mention the other possible human sciences. By studying these three alone, i.e. a science that proposes to study groups, a science that proposes to study the individual being, and a science that explains the correlation between groups and the individual being, we find a multitude of fields and an almost indefinite subdivision of study. This reveals that even concerning only one of these human sciences, the search for unity is quite problematic, in that we must found an often reductive theory to arrive at the unity within each of these sciences. We observe a unity of tendencies rather than a unity of explanatory principles. If we compare the current situation of the human sciences to that of the natural sciences, such as this situation was in antiquity, in the 16th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, we find that at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a physics and a chemistry, perhaps even several physics and several chemistries. Conversely, little by little, at the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, we've seen grand theories arise that have contributed various possibilities of axiomatization. Thus, in the domain of electricity and magnetism, circa 1864, Maxwell's electromagnetic theory of light appeared, which is and probably will remain the example of a creative synthesis. It is a synthesis because it joins together the ancient elements of various studies on the reciprocal actions of currents and fields, on phenomena of induction, and it is creative because it contributes a new notion through which synthesis is possible and without which axiomatization would not exist. The notion of displacement currents, these displacement currents become the propagation of the electromagnetic field, such as Hertz revealed experimentally 20 years later. Could the same work be accomplished in the human sciences? Could human science be founded, obviously, by respecting the possibilities of multiple applications but by having at least a common axiomatics applicable to various domains. I guess that wasn't like a very dense page, but the idea that he was motivated by the desire to axiomatize the human sciences is interesting to me, given that so much of Individuation Volume 1 is focused on like physics and biology, basically, and it's really only psychic and collective individuation that deals with sociology and psychology, among other things. And also, I guess, given, as we noted when we were reading Volume 1, that all of his illustrative examples are in physical and the vital individuation sections, and there are almost no illustrations of the ideas that he has about transindividuality and psychic and collective individuation. It's a bit strange if his goal was his ultimate focus was on the human sciences, as he seems to suggest here.
Yeah, it's definitely in Volume 1. The physical and vital individuation parts are definitely much more worked out than the psychical and collective individuation parts. And in terms of the publication history, we see that he published those first two parts, the physical and vital individuation, in his lifetime in 1958, I believe, or 1960. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, so he publishes those, and then he lived another 27 years after that, and he never published the rest of the book. So I think we can at least speculate that he was not 100% satisfied with the rest of the presentation as it appears in Volume 1 of Individuation. So he's definitely much more complete when it comes to physical and vital individuation, and I think you can sort of make sense of that because physical science is obviously much more advanced and structured than, say, psychology is. So there's much more sort of basic knowledge in physical science that you can sort of take on board and then use as a paradigm and sort of apply in the way that Simondon does in Volume 1, compared to psychology, where pretty much every sort of finding is disputable in some sense, or the actual sort of validity of that result is questioned, and so on. So there's a sort of a stock of knowledge in the case of physical individuation that is not present in the case of psychical individuation. And so just in terms of the material that's available, it does make sense that the first two parts of the book would be much more well developed than the later parts of the book. But yeah, so it's interesting that in terms of the motivation and then the actual results seem to be sort of opposite to each other. Yeah, and that I think also a lot of the secondary literature on Simondon has sort of focused on the first two parts, in part because that's what was available for so long. But it seems, in this text and other places, it seems like what Simondon thought was sort of his more what was more important to him was precisely the psychical and collective individuation that is less well worked out. So yeah, that's also maybe a sort of imbalance in terms of the attention that his work has gotten. Yeah, and then you can also sort of speculate about the external circumstances. Yeah, so like he did have to finish his dissertation and so on. So you can potentially see the psychical and collective individuation part as being sort of rushed, or not as well worked out as the physical and vital individuation, just because he had to get something together so that he could submit as a dissertation. So yeah, I don't know the sort of biographical details and how accurate that is, but that's another sort of suggestion about why it's not as well developed as the first part. And then the other bit that I'll mention in the part that we just read is this example of Maxwell's electromagnetic theory of light, which we've looked at a couple of times in different texts that this example has come up. But just to quickly just mention this, so there's the theory of light as a wave that we talked about last week with Fresnel. So there were sort of two competing theories of light in the 17th century. That Newton proposed a corpuscular theory of light. So light is composed of particles of some kind. And then there was a wave theory of light, which I believe Huygens was associated with. So it says that light is a wave of some kind. It's comparable to sound in some way. And these two theories were sort of competing with each other. They each had their strengths and weaknesses. They were able to explain certain phenomena, but not others. And then, so Maxwell takes the wave theory of light and he sort of unites it with the theory of electricity and magnetism. So he takes all these, light, electricity, magnetism, shows how they all are sort of related to each other. The same constant c, for the speed of light in a vacuum, appears in the theory of electromagnetism and, of course, in the theory of light. And so this one of the consequences of Maxwell's theory, or one of the conclusions that you can draw from Maxwell's theory, is that there should be other forms of electromagnetic radiation. So light is one form of electromagnetic radiation, but there should be electromagnetic radiation at other wavelengths, and that's what was discovered later in the 19th century. Hertz and other people discovered radio waves, ultraviolet radiation, so on, all these other forms of electromagnetic radiation that fall outside of the visible spectrum. And so for Simondon, this is sort of the key example of a creative, what he calls a creative synthesis. So it takes various phenomena in physics of electricity and magnetism and sort of shows how they all sort of link together, how each one brings about the others, and so on. It's a creative synthesis because it's not just sort of taking these different phenomena and seeing what they all have in common, but it has to invent a new set of concepts that allow for us to grasp all these phenomena as part of one sort of underlying phenomenon of electromagnetism. And so for Simondon, this is sort of one of the crowning achievements of science is the theory of electromagnetism. And he is sort of suggesting that the human sciences need a similar type of creative synthesis. So it would be introducing new concepts that allow us to grasp the unity of the human sciences, as opposed to taking each individual science as a sort of limited domain that is independent of the others. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. 61, do you want to read, or I can read if not?
Yes, one second. What page are we on?
We are on page 675 of the PDF. We are at what encourages us to pursue this inquiry.
Okay, and is my microphone okay? Sometimes I've been having okay. What encourages us to pursue this inquiry is the vision of the evolution of the natural sciences. There was once a separate physics and chemistry, now there is a physico-chemistry, and we are seeing the correlations between physics and chemistry become increasingly strong. Would there not be between the two extreme terms, between the theory of groups, sociology, and the theory of individuals, psychology, a way to seek a middle term that would be precisely the active and common center of a possible axiomatization? Indeed, we see in several cases that even if we take the most directly monographic and interiorist individual psychology, or even if we take the sociology of the largest groups, we are always led to a search for correlation, one necessitated by the fact that in sociology there is no group of all groups, or in psychology within the individual there is no element or atom of thought that could be isolated so as to make it the analog of the simple chemical body, which would enable the recomposition of everything through combinations with other simple elements. The isolation of a monad, the psychological atom, or of a human group that would be a totality, a type of social universe, is found to be impossible. In sociology, there is no humanity, and in psychology, there is no ultimate element. We're always at the level of correlations, whether we go toward the search for elements within the individual or towards the vastest social groups. Under these conditions, the lesson gained from the evolution of the natural sciences encourages us to revoke the oldest principles of explanation that have been proposed within the human sciences, insofar as these principles are principles of correlation. This is why we have believed to be able to choose notions such as form, information, and potentials, starting with the notion of form. This notion is probably one of the oldest notions defined by philosophers who have always been interested in the study of human problems. Certainly, the notion of form has evolved quite a bit, but at first we find it in the Platonic archetype, then in Aristotle's matter-form relation, and in the hylomorphic schema. We find it again after a very long winding path in the Middle Ages, and in the 16th century sometimes as Platonic and sometimes as Aristotelian. We also find it again at the very end of the 19th century and in the 20th century, in this resumption of old notions under a new influence called Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology renews the notion of form and, to a certain extent, carries out the synthesis of Platonic archetypal form and Aristotelian hylomorphic form, thanks to an exemplary and explanatory notion drawn from the natural sciences, the notion of field. We will attempt to show that the notion of form is necessary, but that it alone does not make possible the foundation of an axiomatics of the human science if it is not presented within a system that includes information and potentials in the sense in which we speak of potential energy. I will therefore attempt to trace a historical evolution of the notion of form, which is first archetypal, then hylomorphic, and lastly gestaltist. And then I will attempt to show how it is insufficient for our axiomatizing intention. I will then add a certain number of considerations relative to information, and finally I will attempt to present what would allow the notion of information to be joined with that of form. This is what I have called the transductive operation, or also modulation, which can only exist within a domain of reality in a metastable state containing potential energy.
Right. So yeah, he's going to start with the notion of form, as he points out here. So we out of these three notions, form, information, potential, we start with form, and then we look at the historical development of this notion. So the Platonic notion of form, the Aristotelian notion of hylomorphism, form and matter, and then the use of this notion of form in Gestalt psychology. And he's going to argue that the notion of form is insufficient for this axiomatization of the human sciences. So you can't sort of reconstruct the human sciences around the notion of form on its own. But he's going to propose that the notion of form plus the notion of information, and then linked together through this notion of potentials and transductive operation, all of that together is going to allow for the unification of the human sciences in the way that he's calling for here. And then there's also this bit just before that where he talks about how there's no sort of universal group in sociology, and there's no sort of ultimate element in psychology. So I think he made the same point in the psychical individuation chapter, if I remember correctly, that in sociology we never have to do with humanity as a whole or with a universe of every social being, even if to some extent in the development since Simondon's time we have of course globalization, and maybe we can say that today there is a social group that is humanity as a whole. But this social group is, in principle, open in the sense that we, even if every human being, as a matter of fact, participates in a particular social group that we can call humanity, that would just be a sort of contingent fact about the set of living beings that or psychical individuals that happen to be part of this social group. It would always in principle be possible that Martians or some creature that lives in the ocean or whatever, some other intelligent creature might not be part of our society and might have its own society, and so in this sense there's no universe of social order, even if we take it that there is such a thing as humanity, which maybe was not the case in the time Simondon was writing. even if we take it that today there is a social group of humanity that includes every human being, there's still sort of the possibility of other social beings that have their own societies that are not included in humanity. And so that, in that sense, there's no universe of social beings. There's no one social group that includes every social being. And then even if we do take it that there is something like humanity, a social group that every human being belongs to, it's clear that within that social group there are also subgroups. Whether you want to talk about nations, social classes, different regions within different nations, and so on. So each of these sort of subgroups is a social group as well, and the sociology has to do not just with the interaction of individuals within each of these groups, but also the interactions of these groups with each other. And so it's also in that sense that we can't say that there's a single group that would be a universe of the social order, because the social order is itself structured in terms of the relationships between different groups. So in both these senses, the social universe is not, or there's no such thing as a social universe, a single group in which every other individual would find its place. And then the other side is in psychology, there's no atom, there's no sort of element of psychology out of which you could build up the whole sort of psychical life of a living being, of a psychical individual. So especially in 19th century psychology, there was this atomistic approach where psychologists tried to analyze experience into its elements, so that like visual experience would be made up of colored points, and there was a whole sort of debate or discussion about how exactly the spatial arrangement of colored points is brought about. So, like, for example, if you see a red dot to the left of a green dot, that to the left of is not something that you have a visual sensation of. So how exactly do you how is that spatial structure sort of part of your visual experience? And then there were people who argued that there were spatial signs, so that like there is something in your experience that is a sign of the location of a red dot, which is kind of an artificial solution, I think. But in general, the idea was that you start with like the most basic sets of sensations, color dots and tones and sensations of touch and so on. And then these elements are sort of bound together through the laws of association. So contiguity, causation, and I forget, similarity, I think, was the other one. Anyway, through the laws of association, we tend to sort of join together these different sensations. And so we say that, this white object that has a certain, or this white sensation that we have, and the sensation of a certain taste get associated together, and then we say that that's sugar. We just sort of join together all these elementary sensations, and our psychical life is built up through the combination of these psychological atoms. And just as a sort of contingent historical fact, that approach to psychology didn't really work. There are lots of reasons that this is not really a good way of explaining mental life. And Gestalt psychology was sort of developed in large part in opposition to this approach to psychology. And so one of the sort of key facts that they pointed out, for example, is that if you take a melody, a simple tune, Happy Birthday or whatever, if you change one note in the melody, then it becomes a different melody. It has a completely different sort of structure. It's not the same melody. Whereas if you take the whole melody and move it up an octave or down an octave, then it sort of preserves the same structure. It's still Happy Birthday, even if you sing it an octave higher or an octave lower. And so here we see that rather than having a melody being built up out of individual sensations of tone, instead the whole melody has a certain pattern that can be preserved through transformations, and whereas other transformations modify that pattern and sort of turn it into a different pattern. And so this was taken to be a sort of anti-atomistic argument in the sense that it shows that the melody as a whole is perceived or experienced, as opposed to just having a sequence of tones that are associated with each other through the laws of association. So that's sort of the background that Simondon is working with here, and that's sort of the argument that he is presupposing against the notions of an atom or an element of experience and a universe of society.
And this idea that he's trying to find an axiomatic to unite the human sciences, he often speaks of signification as the discovery of a new axiomatic. And I wonder if he sort of sees himself as trying to find a signification between, I guess, the disparate terms of these concepts from information sciences and physics, and on the one hand, and then on the other hand, human sciences like sociology and psychology. And if maybe that would be an example of the kind of individuation that is a relation in knowledge that he talks about sometimes, and I guess in Volume 1 and in Allegmatics.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting suggestion. I think the way that he would describe the sort of intellectual operation that he's doing here is he sometimes talks about taking physical individuation as a paradigm. So this crystallization example, and then using analogy to sort of spread this paradigm or the schema of operation of this paradigm into other domains. And so this operation itself is a transductive operation. So you take the crystallization idea, the schema of operation of crystallization is a sort of structural germ that can be introduced into another domain of thought and then bring about a structuration in that domain as well. There's this. So his concept of transduction and his sort of transductive account of knowledge is has a sort of reflexive character in the sense that it itself operates in a transductive way. So I think that's I think he's trying to sort of demonstrate the validity of this operation of thought sort of in practice. So it's rather than sort of deducing the validity of this mode of operation of thought, he is sort of putting it to work and then showing how it sort of self-generates its own validity, if that makes sense. He's performing the actual operation of transduction sort of in front of us and allowing us to sort of observe it in action, as opposed to sort of starting from first principles and then deducing that transductive thinking is valid from on that basis. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read. Just give me a second. Right, where are we? Yes. Okay. Here we should add an explanatory aside concerning the subject of the term modulation. The word is not taken in the broad technical sense that it has when one speaks of the modulation of the final stage of an emitter, but in the more restricted sense that designates the operation being completed in an amplificative relay with an infinite number of states, like, for example, a hot cathode, triode, tetrode, penthode, or a transistor. Modulation is the operation through which a signal of low energy, like one that is sent onto the grid of a triode, actualizes with a certain number of possible degrees the potential energy represented by the anodic circuit and the actuator, which is the external charge of this anodic circuit. The term is not perfect since it is slightly ambiguous, given that one also means by modulation this mutual influence of two energies, one of which is the future support of information, like, for example, a high-frequency oscillation, and the other of which is the energy already informed by a signal, like, for example, the low frequency current that modulates the high frequency oscillation in the procedure of the anodic modulation of emitters. Thus, there is a semantic precision that must be contributed from the start in order to define this type of physical interaction. If pure psychology and pure sociology are impossible because there is no extreme element in psychology and no set of all sets in sociology, it is necessary to see how the psychologists and the sociologists of antiquity treated the processes of interaction and influence. Let's first take up the significative and complementary opposition between the archetypal form in Plato and the hylomorphic form in Aristotle. Plato's archetypal form is the model of everything that is superior, eternal, and unique according to a vertical mode of interaction. The archetype from arche, meaning origin, and tupos, meaning imprint, is the first mode. This word designates the stamp by means of which money can be minted, what we call a hallmark today. The tupos is the imprint and also the strike. With a piece of engraved steel, characters can be stamped onto a tablet of precious metal, and this archetype can yield the same figure, the same configuration, with this deformable matter of the metal tablet. If the archetype is made of good steel, all the pieces minted with the same hallmark resemble one another and are recognizable because, in a causal manner, they all stem from the same operation of modulation based on the archetype. The archetype can certainly degrade, but its ontological superiority should be noted. If one of the pieces is lost, only this piece becomes lost. Whereas if the archetype is lost, a new one must be cast from the piece, and the piece can only contain a lesser perfection than that of the archetype. The second archetype will not be absolutely similar to the first. In other words, from one piece to the next minted with the same archetype, there is a certain number of random fluctuations, a grain of sand here, an inequality of metal there, covered by a central tendency. This central normative and superior tendency is represented by the first form, which is that of the hallmark, the archetype. Here we find a model of a process of interaction that hardly merits the name interaction, but is an extreme term for all the other possible types of interaction. The non-reciprocal, irreversible interaction without return between the piece and the archetype, which harbors an asymmetry that is fundamental. The archetype is superior to the piece. There is no complementary rapport, for the archetype does not require pieces to exist. It is both anterior and superior. It exists before every piece. This is the model of the theory of ideas in Plato, the forms, which are like the archetypes, allowing for the explanation of the existence of sensible objects. These sensible objects are comparable to pieces that were minted with hallmarks, the ideas. The hallmarks are immutable. They exist beyond the sphere of the fixed stars and do not degrade. The engendered being, i.e. the sensible object, which is in Genesis coming to be, and phtora, passing away, can degrade, but the form, toidos, does not degrade. It is no longer possible, it is no longer capable of progress, which leads to a theory of knowledge in which man can only recall the form on the occasion of encountering the sensible, and the difficulties that arise when the knowing subject deals with the sensible object. Man can only recall the vision of the forms and interpret the sensible object based on this vision, without a veritable inductive approach of thought. Why? Because the entire perfection of form, the entire perfection of structural content is given at the origin. Plato constructs a metaphysical universe and an epistemological system in which perfection is given at the origin. Perfection, the highest richness of structure, resides in this world that is beyond the sphere of the fixed stars, i.e. is itself eternal and transcendent, and is subject to neither degradation nor progress. Degradation only characterizes what is engendered. What is engendered based on the relation of exemplarism can degrade, or instead, to the mere extent in which the soul is the sister of the ideas, it can direct an ascent back towards original perfection. Here we have an example of the first Platonism, whereby philosophy's intent is to seek out, by way of this phroura, ward, under the watchful eye of the gods. This expression is attributed to Socrates, a return to this world in which we once again rediscover the archetypes. Okay, let's stop here. So we have his bit about modulation here, which he explains in terms of vacuum tubes, which is probably not a very helpful explanation for us in the 21st century, since we rarely use vacuum tubes. But the idea of modulation is you have one carrier signal, you have a transmission of energy, and then you have some sort of modulation of that carrier signal. So you have a fluctuation in terms of frequency or amplitude or whatever that modifies the carrier signal. So this is what he means by modulation. And then he goes on to talk, so he's going to go through his history of the notion of form. And so he starts with Plato, and so he takes it that the sort of technical paradigm that Plato is drawing from is the minting of money. So you have the what here he calls the hallmark. I'm just trying to find what it is in French because that's a kind of right. That's coin. Yeah, I'm not sure if hallmark is a great translation here, but anyway, the idea is that you have when you're minting a coin, you use a piece of steel that has the shape that you want in reverse on it, and then you stamp the piece of precious metal, gold or silver or whatever, and you impose your desired form onto your piece of precious metal, and that's your coin. And Simondon here points out that the archetype has a sort of ontological priority over, or the stamp has an ontological priority over the pieces of money that you produce with it. So if you lose a piece of money, then you just lose one of the you've only lost that one piece of money or that one instance of the form. Whereas if you lose the archetype, you have to try to recreate it on the basis of one of the pieces of money, and so you lose information in the sense that each piece of money is slightly imperfect in relation to the stamp. That if there's a piece of dust or the metal is not entirely even or whatever, every time you use the stamp, you are producing a slightly imperfect copy of that form. And so if you lose the stamp and you have to recreate the stamp on the basis of one of the pieces of money, then you're copying an imperfect copy. And so you've lost information in this process. So it's in this sense that the stamp has an ontological priority over the piece of money that you produce with the stamp. Right, and this is the sort of model of the notion of form for Plato. So he takes it that entities in general are produced or sort of are the result of a kind of ontological operation of stamping. So there are these forms that are sort of imposed onto matter, and the entities that we see in the world are these sort of imperfect copies of the forms. And so in the same way that the stamp has an ontological priority over the pieces of money that you make with it, the forms have an ontological priority over the entities that participate in the forms or that are the result of this sort of ontological stamping operation. And then the consequence of this metaphysical conception in the theory of knowledge is that knowledge can only ever be a recollection or a reminiscence of the forms. So the forms have the structure sort of in its perfect state at the outset, at the origin of entities. And so knowing those entities can only ever be sort of a reacquaintance with that form or with that structure. And so the idea of an inductive approach of knowledge, where you would sort of start from individual entities and then sort of try to grasp some sort of general principle that governs them on that basis, this whole approach to knowledge is ruled out just by virtue of the metaphysical structure of the universe that Plato proposes. So we only ever have knowledge by virtue of reminiscence or recollection of the forms, and so this is what knowledge consists in. And then so the metaphysical picture and the epistemological picture are sort of in alignment with each other in Plato.
So the idea of the modulation in the triode, it seems like what he's saying is that the sort of the third, can't remember if the grid is also a cathode in the triode, is what actualizes the potential energy between the anode and the cathode. That would make sense to me in light of if he's saying that, he seems to say that the role of the grid is amplification, which is also how he describes the process of crystallization. So it would make sense if the amplification of the grid was performing the same function that the limit of the crystal was performing in structuring or turning the energetic condition in the solution into the structure of the crystal itself. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge of vacuum tube operation is pretty limited. When we were reading on the mode of existence of technical objects, there's a long development about the history of vacuum tubes and the triodes to tetrodes and so on, which we struggled with because none of us were like vacuum tube experts. And yeah, so it's kind of unfortunate that this is his example because it's one that is pretty obscure to those of us who do not know a lot about vacuum tubes.
I remember that part. That was one of my favorite parts of technical objects. Yeah, anodes and cathodes.
Yeah, and so that for in that book it was an example of increasing concreteness of technical objects. So it each sort of stage of the evolution of a vacuum tube sort of makes it more concrete in his sense of that word, which we looked at in that book. But here, yeah, I think you're right, Angus, that modulation is a kind of amplification. So you have a low energy signal. So, like for instance, if you have a frequency modulation, you have a low frequency current that modulates a high frequency current, and the low frequency one has low energy, and then it's amplified by the high frequency current. And so this is how like a radio operates, for example, with FM radio. And the so this is a sort of instance of modulation and instance of amplification, the same way that the crystal, you start with the germ crystal, which has a certain structure, and then that structure gets amplified across the whole domain of crystallization. So likewise here you have a sort of domain of the high frequency current, the high energy current, which undergoes structuration, which amplifies, in which the other signal, the low frequency signal, the low energy signal, is amplified. So yeah, like in each case, we have modulation as a kind of amplification of a signal, as a starting point of information that gets amplified across a domain that is not yet structured.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know anything about vacuum tubes either. The other thing that kind of stuck out to me in this, the paragraphs we just read, is the idea of, or I guess the role of asymmetry in the Platonic model of hylomorphism. It seems like in the Platonic archetypal hylomorphism, there is an absolute asymmetry between the form as that which imprints itself on the coins, for instance, and the coins themselves, which simply receive the form. But in transduction or in individuation, there's also an asymmetry, for instance, between the two monocular images in vision. And I think he also talks about this in terms of pendulums, pendula, I guess, communicating their oscillations to one another, where there has to be asymmetry in order for that communication to happen, but the asymmetry can't be too great. So it seems like one of the differences, in addition to presumably the Platonic hylomorphism ignoring the action of individuation itself, is that the asymmetry between the terms is so great that there isn't any deformation of the Platonic archetype in the same way that there is even a very small deformation of the mold in the brick making example that he gives, which maybe is in that instance some degree of or indication that the asymmetry in that form-taking operation is not absolute in the sense it is for Plato.
Yeah, the brick making example I think is probably the best one. So in that example, he talks about if you have the form taking operation in the brick making example is an actual physical operation of taking a mold that has a rectangular form and packing it with clay and then uh, and then allowing that clay to dry and then the brick has takes on the form of the mold. And he points out that this is an actual physical operation in the sense that the walls of the mold have to bend slightly and then resist as the clay gets packed into the mold, and they actually impose a physical force onto the clay. And so it's only insofar as there is this physical interaction that the form gets imposed on the clay. And so he takes it. So in volume 1, his criticism of the hylomorphic schema, he's thinking primarily of Aristotle there, but his criticism of the hylomorphic schema was that this interaction between the form and the matter is sort of left out of the account. It's this obscure zone in the middle. And so he thinks that we need to instead start from that middle point and then show how matter and form sort of arise out of that middle point. And so here, in the case of Plato, so the physical paradigm of the coin making. So in reality, of course, there is some sort of interaction in the sense that the stamp does degrade. If you keep stamping a million coins, then you're wearing out that stamp slightly every time you make a coin, and then by the time you make a million coins, it's probably worn down considerably. There is a real interaction, but this interaction is sort of we sort of abstract away from it when we form the intellectual notion of a form. So the idea of a form is a kind of super stamp that would never degrade, and we sort of leave out of account the reverse interaction where the metal that we're stamping to some extent imposes its form onto the stamp itself. So we ignore that side of the operation. We only look at the one direction of operation. And so I think, maybe this is also tied with what we were talking about earlier in the way that there's the reversible interaction in sort of reversible form-taking operation in living individuation. So a living being can learn a habit and then unlearn it, and then learn a new habit, which is sort of grounded in this fundamentally irreversible operation at the physical level. I think maybe we can see the irreversibility of maybe this is sort of the contrary side of this, the irreversibility of the form-taking operation in the Platonic archetype schema is sort of realized in a reversible operation of form transmission or information transmission between the stamp and the metal. So they're in interaction with each other as opposed to an asymmetrical, irreversible form imposition. So we see sort of both directions where the asymmetry and the symmetry are sort of in reciprocal interaction with each other, depending on which side of the operation you want to look at.
Yeah, that's a great way to put that. I think it's also interesting that it seems like part of his criticism, or maybe his whole criticism here of Plato is similar to his criticism of Aristotle in the brick-making example, which is basically that Plato's is improperly applying a technical paradigm without really taking account of all of the details of the paradigm. For instance, the reversibility of form taking, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, it would be interesting to maybe go back to the part of history of the notion of individual when he talks about Plato and Aristotle, and then try to tie this criticism of the hylomorphic schema to his discussion of Plato and Aristotle, and to see to what extent there's a difference in his treatment of Plato and of Aristotle, because well, we'll see more on Aristotle in a minute, or when we get to that part of this text. But one sort of key point of difference is that Aristotle does think that there is a sort of inductive knowledge gaining process. So you can learn about entities by starting from looking at a bunch of trees and then gaining the concept of a tree in general, or of a horse in general, or whatever. And ultimately that's the only way that you can learn about entities in general, is by abstracting from the particularity of each individual entity, but finding what they have in common, the shared form that explains the structure of the individual entities. So in Aristotle, we have a different epistemological picture, and then as we saw in when we're looking at Plato, the epistemology and the metaphysics are closely linked with each other. So to the extent that Aristotle has a different epistemology, we have to assume that there's a different metaphysics as well. So we would have to, I think, particularize this argument that Simondon makes about the form-taking operation. We would have to sort of specify it in a different way for Plato as we would for Aristotle. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit, next page or so. If someone else would like to read.
I will.
Sure.
Yeah. If I wish to depict this manner, this part, right?
Yes, exactly.
If I wish to depict this manner of considering form in a single stroke, we'll say that since form is perfect from the outset, Platonism constitutes a system of a conservation in respect of the idea given once and for all, or instead it is a return to the idea. Science is a reminiscence and anamnesis, and it is also a contemplation when one has just rediscovered what the soul recollects, because it is adelphe ton eidon, sister of the ideas. Individual morality is a conservation. It is the conservation of the structure of the individual through which the individual realizes the idea of man. Individual morality is the conservation of the relation that must exist appropriately between nous, epithumia, intellect, passion, and appetite, according to the principle of justice. But in fact, it should be called justness, that preserves the structural system that characterizes the individual. However, such as it is presented in Platonism, the form, insofar as it is superior and immutable, is perfectly suited to present the structure of the group and founds on implicit sociology, a political theory of the ideal group. This group is more stable than individuals, and it is endowed with such an inertia that seems permanent. Furthermore, relative permanence is considered by Plato as being, or faced with being, true immobility. We know that the ideal city is one that must not vary. The task of philosopher magistrate, who knows the number of the city and the measure that characterizes the relations between the different social classes, just as he knows the rapport between the virtues of the individual, is to be the guardian of the constitution. The law is what allows the city to remain unmodified, just as physical laws remind us invariance. Plato has indeed discovered the invariant. However, based on the example of the sciences, we know that the invariant could be considered as characteristic of a physical theory. The conservation of energy, conservation of matter, conservation of the totality constituted by matter and energy. For Plato, the invariant of the idea, but this idea is the structure of the group, founding on metaphysical sociology. A pure sociology becomes metaphysics. Such a conception of form leads to realist idealism and to repudiation of any possibility of logical empiricism or of physical combinatories, like those of Leucippus and Democritus, that constitute the being starting with the elements and the fortuitous encountered due to chance. No doubt Plato was not absolutely satisfied with this doctrine, since we see, due to what Aristotle left us in books M and N of his metaphysics, that toward the end of his life and in his initiatory teaching, Plato wanted to find a formula that could explain becoming. Instead of seeking to flee from here to there, he wanted to immortalize in the sensible. The doctrine of the number ideas perhaps indicates a desire to discover a more precise, more essential meaning in becoming. In the same way, the notion of the indefinite diet that the large and the small and of hot and cold, which allows for a more precise explanation of the material, the world measured, is more appropriate for sensible objects and their genetic becoming than the eidos. However, this is such a part of Platonic inspiration, at least in the form that was passed on to posterity and that has become Platonism, is the archetypal form, i.e. the explanation of the presentation of process influence that places a complete structure before and above all endangered beings. Here, or should I continue?
Yeah, let's stop here because he's going to go on to Aristotle next, so we can stick with the Plato section. Right, so here he talks about the sociological picture that Plato develops in the Republic. So, of course, in the Republic, he gives this sort of analogy between the individual human being and the city. So the human being is composed of these three principles or these three psychological faculties or whatever you want to call them. So there's nous, which is translated as intellect. There's thumos, which is translated as passion. And there's epithumia, which is usually translated as appetite. And so to each of these principles, there corresponds a certain class in the city, in the ideal city that he puts together in the Republic. So nous, of course, corresponds to the guardians who guard the laws of the city. Thumos corresponds to the warrior class who protect the city, and then epithumia it corresponds to the peasant / artisan class, the people who produce the goods that are needed for the life of the city. And then for he takes it that justice is a kind of proportion of these elements. So both in the individual, you have to have the right proportion of these different sort of faculties of the soul. And then in the city, there has to be the right proportion and relationship between the different classes that make up the city. And so ultimately, the political and moral philosophy that goes along with this picture is one of conservation. So the correct political action is the one that preserves the structure of the city, that preserves the relationship between the classes. So what Simondon compares this to is the physical notion of an invariant. So some of the sort of basic invariants in physical science are, of course, the conservation of matter, the conservation of energy. So in like a simple mechanical system, you have a momentum is conserved throughout all the different interactions. So if you have billiard balls bouncing off each other, or a pulley lifting up a weight and then dropping it, or whatever, these interactions in principle, they conserve momentum. The sort of tricky point is that some of that momentum gets dissipated as heat through friction. So you have to account for that in your sort of conservation equation. But yeah, so each of these, each sort of physical interaction conserves a certain property, so that property remains invariant across that operation. And so Simondon takes it that Plato has sort of discovered the notion of an invariant, and he takes it that the correct political action in a city is the one that preserves invariance, the invariants that are the sort of quantitative ratio of the different classes in the city. And then he points to what is sometimes known as Plato's unwritten doctrine, which is a pretty obscure topic, precisely because it's unwritten. So there's some testimony in ancient authors like Aristotle and others about how Plato had a somewhat different doctrine that he taught in his academy, where which had to do with becoming in relation to the indefinite dyad. So this indefinite dyad includes all these notions like large and small, hot and cold, etc. And there would be some sort of account, according to this unwritten doctrine, of the becoming of entities in relation to this indefinite dyad. So entities can become hotter or colder, or larger or smaller, or whatever. And this would not be so. Rather than seeing an entity as being a sort of imperfect copy of an idea, you would instead see entities as being situated in relation to this indefinite dyad and being in becoming in relation to this indefinite dyad. But again, the whole unwritten doctrine is pretty obscure because we only have secondhand testimony, in particular from Aristotle, who criticizes a lot of the doctrines of Plato. So we can't be that certain of what exactly those doctrines were that Aristotle was criticizing. Yeah, and Angus has posted a link in the chat to a book about the unwritten teachings of Plato. And yeah, so some scholars have tried to reconstruct what exactly these teachings were, based on the sort of hints that we have in other ancient writers. But yeah, it's definitely a difficult undertaking because of the fact that we don't have any firsthand records of what these teachings were.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the Tübingen School of Plato scholarship is, honestly, but I was just looking at this. There's a chapter in this book on the indefinite dyad, but the way that they present it, there are two principles which are prior to everything, like prior even to the forms, because I guess the dyad is supposed to be responsible for the fact that there's a multiplicity of forms, among other things. But I remember you mentioning in a previous session that, because this is not the first time Simondon has brought up the indefinite dyad, that you could think of the disparation of terms in signification or in individuation as being related to the indefinite dyad, maybe the terms being like an indefinite dyad, like the dyad in Plato. But it seems like in Plato, the indefinite dyad is related to the opposite principle, which is the one, which is the principle of unity. And I wonder if Simondon sees, the signification of these disparate terms as unification, like the one is a unification of the indefinite dyad in Plato. And it seems like there would be an interesting connection there between that idea and something like the antinomies in Kant, and then maybe from there to Hegel, as we discussed earlier, in relation to that footnote in History of the Notion of the Individual.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same about this sort of relationship between Simondon and dialectics or dialectical thought. And of course, Plato is sort of the forefather of dialectics. Like some of his dialogue, the Parmenides, for example, is like a 100% dialectical dialogue. Like it's sort of looking at the transformations of concepts of, if the one is not, then being is, or vice versa, and all these different sort of dialectical inversions of concepts. So this sort of ambiguous relationship of Simondon to dialectics, I think maybe we can connect it with this ambiguous relationship between the indefinite dyad and the one, in the sense that so for Simondon, the indefinite dyad, or this disparation, is something that has to sort of pre-exist the process of individuation. So we have to think of the pre-individuated reality before individuation as containing these different, I don't want to say components, because it's not something, they aren't like entities that already exist, but it has to contain these sort of different functions or principles or something. It has to contain this disparation within itself already. And it's only after the process of individuation that you can sort of point to these sort of individuated entities, but there has to be this sort of duality has to already be there in the pre-individual reality. So what exactly this duality or this multiplicity that exists within the pre-individual reality consists in, or how we can understand it, I think is a difficult point for Simondon. I think maybe that's a point where this relationship between the dyad and the one is sort of reproduced in Simondon's thought. He sort of runs into some of the same problems as Plato does. Okay, so we're pretty much at time. And we're also at a sort of natural stopping point, because we're going to go on to Aristotle next. So I would suggest we stop here and then pick up from there next time. I think we probably need another 2 more sessions to finish this. And in the Simondon forum here, I put the PDF of the in Imagination and Invention. I was able to get the DRM removed, and so I have a PDF in there for those who want to take a look at that, and then we can go on to that once we finish form information potentials. Yeah, thanks everyone. See you next week.